Okay. Hi everybody. Sorry. Thanks for coming along, and thanks to Francis for inviting me to MC this. I am slightly intimidated. So my name is Lois, and I edit Dublin Inquirer, which is a little local newspaper here. And I'm actually going to get the panelists to introduce themselves because they know the most interesting things about themselves. And then, we'll get started. I think we're going to throw the room, the panel open to questions from the room, sort of, I don't know after how long we want to do that, we'll see. But if things come up and you really want to, say something, you can put your hand up even. We'll see how that goes. You look very polite. So, oh, no. Okay. So maybe we can start with Francis.
My name is Francis Doherty. I'm Head of Communications at Phillip McVerry Trust, and at the minute I oversee the Empty Homes programme with some colleagues here in the room.
Okay, I'm Alison, Harvey. I work for the Heritage Council, so I oversee the national planning programmes, and we do a lot of regeneration programmes as well, so hopefully we'll get to talk about that too.
Hello, my name is Phillip Crowe. I'm an architect by profession, and I've recently been involved in research, and I've co-founded, along with Aoife, who's been taking the tours this week, a social enterprise called Space Engagers, and we've produced a participatory mapping project called Reusing Dublin, which the Peter McVerry Trust has been using for the past couple of years. Cool.
Okay. I thought we'd kick it off with Phillip, given that you've sort of got 3 years now of experience trying to map vacancy through space engagers, and maybe what you've learned along the way about through that process about vacancy and about even collecting the data around that.
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing to say is that something like Reusing Dublin, which is a crowdsourcing platform, is never going to provide a definitive data set on vacancy. But what has happened is that you get the same buildings coming up time and time again. We've had 2 or 3 iterations of the project, and the same buildings come up. But over the period of 3 years, a number of buildings have being developed, so we can see quite a lot of change at the moment. For instance, there's the Lucky Duck along the Danger Street. There's River House, which is one of the classics, and seems to be being pulled down at the moment. I cycled past there the other day. The building opposite Duns and South Great George Street. So there is a lot of fluidity, but those changes are absolutely to do with, they're market driven. It's not like there's been any legislative change that has brought that about. And I suppose, what have we learned? Well, I suppose we've learned that we're one stepping stone in a long series of attempts in the city to map vacancy. And Jerry Cairns in Maynooth figured out that there was a vacancy mapping done in 1789 by the Vicar of St. Catherine's in Thomas Street, which found that about 9% of homes in the city were vacant. And then there's breaks, but in 1914 there was a mapping done in the 1980s, and in 2000 the City Council in Dublin started mapping it again. But what we are doing is never going to provide a comprehensive mapping, but it is useful primarily, I think, to the Peter McVerry Trust in some ways for engaging people with the issue, giving people an opportunity to take part in sort of saying, look, this is madness, all these buildings that are empty, and identifying them and taking part in something. But I suppose what's really missing is a comprehensive data set that we should be using as our base and allowing people to enrich with their own local information. And that data set just does not exist in this country. Now, myself and Alison and Isolde in the housing agency here have been involved in trying to set out a vision to the department of how you could use proxy data sets to come up with a really fantastic data set to base Reusing Dublin on. And there are great international precedents for that, and I've been actively looking at one in Philadelphia.
Okay, so how would that work? Obviously, so the CSO data you think is inadequate because...
No, I don't. I mean, the CSO data is the CSO data. It is collected in a certain way. The geodirectory data is collected in a certain way, and that's to do with postmen. We're asking postmen to deliver information. And the department has started, there's been a lot of movement in the last couple of years where, we have all sorts of different strategies have come out, and that is really positive. And the department is starting to put together a system for mapping vacancy. But it doesn't seem ambitious enough to me, because there are so many data sets out there now, and we're supposed to be a smart city, and we're promoting ourselves as a high-tech city. what you can be using is all sorts of different data sets that you layer up, which is what they do in Philadelphia. And that's data from water, from the electricity board, from licenses and inspections. There's endless data that's to do with individual buildings. Put them all together and then you have a flagging system that says, oh, but that's quite likely to be vacant. So in Philadelphia, they have a ranking system. The computer basically says yes or no. And you get a ranking, and then they go and investigate that. And that seems a very sensible thing to do. And, you know, the tech is not complicated. It's just GIS. So reusing Dublin would work much, much better. It's very limited in what it can do at the moment, although it is being very useful, I hope, for Peter McVerry Trust. It would be much better if we were verifying and enriching data and engaging people with the issue through this process of mapping, which is a very engaging thing to do. We all love mapping.
Yeah, like obviously, Francis, that like once you get to the next step of having identified the vacant buildings, I think something that you've come across a lot is this idea of transparency around property ownership and how you then go on to identify who owns it. Like if, say, there was this amazing data set of flagged buildings that you could then go and sort of work with and go further. Do you think, I mean, is there another step that needs to happen sort of alongside that in terms of sort of transparency around the land registry or
yeah, I suppose from Peter McVerry Trust's point of view, greater information or transparency around property ownership would be useful. If it's a non-statutory body that's trying to go out and contact the owners, and engage them and bring the properties back into use themselves, then having an up-to-date, comprehensive property registration system is essential. So at the minute, the easiest part of the process is almost identifying the empty building. So we do visual sort of street-by-street checks. We have the crowdsourced information from News in Dublin, and then we are, as Philip's alluded to, the geo directory from An Post. We can cross-check that, and then there's other information that we can get our hands on that tells us the building is likely to be vacant. But then when we go to do the research as to who owns the building, the majority of properties in Dublin aren't registered. So only since 2011 there's been that obligation to register the new owner once the property changes hands. But if you think of Dublin's historic core, properties aren't changing hands, and property registrations where they do exist often date back to the 60s and 70s, some of them even further, and then many of them simply aren't registered. So that transparency would be hugely helpful, because at the minute we're identifying buildings, we're then whittling that down to being able to identify an owner, then writing out to the owner, and then you're constantly whittling it down to a small number of properties that might be returnable for us. But if there was a statutory body that was the lead authority, that there are databases available on property ownership that maybe revenue have access to, but that we wouldn't or shouldn't have access to as a charitable body. So it's sort of a question as to who's going to lead out on this long term, and what type of system are we building. And it's sort of the reason we're involved in it, because we're trying to find solutions, and housing is the solution to homelessness. But we're also trying to lead by example. If a small niche organisation like Peter McVerry Trust can go out and return to use a couple of hundred buildings, even while responding to a homeless crisis, why can't we do this at scale across the country on a systematic basis? And it's showing that it can be done is part of the battle, because there's a lot of skepticism around sort of empty buildings, about the challenges about private property rights and whatnot. So it's really getting out there and doing it. But I think going back to the transparency of the ownership, it's a huge issue. It's really labour intensive to go, like we're going in limited information, then there's very limited information online, very limited information then when you go in and check the microfilms.
And if you're from outside of Dublin, to have to come into the city is presumably a bit of a...
Yeah, so if you're coming up and trying to find property ownership details, then if you're, like we've, at Peter McVerry Trust, we're part of a network of housing associations, and they've, you know, small towns and villages might have their own small housing association that builds a small development for elderly people or a community housing scheme. And then they're saying to us, well, actually, we know 4 or 5 buildings are empty in our village. What can we do? And we're saying, well, there's schemes available. You just need to find out the owner. So they might know from local information the families or the ownership, but if they don't, then they need to be able to access that information similarly. So it is a huge issue.
Squat them and then get them
We had a couple of people into the exhibition today giving examples of France and the Netherlands around the squatting rights. So a bit sensitive at the moment.
Or the other trick, I know somebody had done it, an architect in Limerick, you just put scaffolding up on the building. If it's your neighbour and you need to fix something because it's affecting, you put scaffolding up and the owner emerges fairly quickly. But the other thing is it's poor quality data, but it's also inaccessible in that you have to pay for it every single time. Am I correct?
Yeah. So
or
like
do you have exemption from that?
No, so like we're the trust is self-financing a lot of the research entirely, and then when we get to the point where we might have a capital project, we can get state funding for the capital. But all the research and all the things we're trying to do is self-funded. So every time we do a search online, it might be $250, but or more, and you're adding up. And like if you're tracking a property ownership and it's changed hands 16 or 20 times, particularly if you're looking at since 2008 and a lot of the financial institutions that have come in. So like they're constantly creating new companies and assets are being transferred, and I think there was one the other day that it had changed. There were 16 different owners attached to a property on the same date. And it's sort of like, well, if we're trying to find out who owns this, it's incredibly difficult. And then we've got to the point where now we notice that properties aren't being registered in a timely fashion. So we know a property on Dorset Street changed hands in 2016 between two financial entities. The company that sold it to the other company in 2016 is the last listed owner, but 2 years later the new owner hasn't on the system. So like why aren't they on the system? Why aren't they in there contactable like that? They should be. So it's
in terms of kind of identifying vacancy, Alison, you've sort of done this looks really, really cool collaborative town centre health check. I don't know if people know about that, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but also like are there issues that have come up while you're doing this around sort of like vacancy and identifying it, and when people are going around sort of surveying, working out sort of what is vacant when and
yeah, well actually what we're finding is that I suppose like we're focusing on the towns, right, small towns around the country, so 10,000 plus are just around that threshold. So I can't really talk about Dublin as such, but the towns that we're looking at, say Tralee or whatever, so we've surveyed it. There's a 15-step process, and the first thing is to look at land use and to look at vacancy. Now what we found in Tralee, for example, was Denny Street, which is this beautiful Georgian street, had 20% on the ground floor but 80% on the upper floors, right? And then as a result of that, sort of, it kind of jumped out of the map or off the map when we looked at the vacancy rates. So then we set up another project in Denny Street to get all the owners and tenants together. So we did workshops with them, and we brought the fire officer in, and we asked them, what are your barriers? I think a lot of it is potentially about perception, and maybe people have gone to the local authority and they haven't got the answers the first time. Like I'm a planner, I work in regeneration, I get very frustrated on behalf of communities, so what we were trying to do, the Heritage Council, was to fund this project. And we're also now working with the SEAI to try and look at doing building and energy retrofit, right? Okay. So there's no point, getting the use into the building unless we do up the building so that they're sort of BER compliant or whatever. Even though they are protected, but it's to try and look at it in terms of trying to get the economies of scale. So for Dublin, I think it's enormously difficult to do that. When we find in towns, who owns that building, it's easier to go to somebody in a small town and say, do you know what's happening with that building? Yeah. And one of the 15 steps, one of the key sort of steps is to do ownership. It's impossible to get the sort of economies of scale unless we get these people into a room and to work with them and to facilitate with them and to do the capacity building, to try and find out how can we remove the barriers, because it is all about barriers.
And what has happened there? Have those top floors come back into use? Have they gradually...
Well, at the minute we are sort of trying to work through the costs, right? So then phase 2 was to work out what are the cost implications, what is the investment appraisal. Again, I think it's easier to do it if you do it collaboratively, because you get the economies of scale, and then you can also start to talk about the common good. It's my fundamental belief that there's no point doing it building by building. It's too inefficient in terms of economics and for the public purse. And what we should be looking at is the way that other countries do it. They look at townscape so that the programme is based on a street, and that the cost benefit can be actually tailored for that, so that you're looking at social benefits, right, rather than private benefits. And I would like to sort of, pursue that with the towns that we've got now. Another thing I was saying to you before we started was, so we did land use surveys in 7 towns in 2016, and we know what the vacancy rate was and where the vacant properties are in those towns. And now in the next few weeks, if we do the surveys again, we have a 2-year picture. And with the planning and development regs that came in, the regulations came in February, which is for exempted development for property that's been vacant for more than 2 years. This is where we're really going to ramp it up, because we're going to be able to identify those buildings around the country and sort of scale it up and get those people into a room and try and help them with a financial incentive, with a programme, and to try and get the wheel turning. You know, it's going to be impossible if we do it building by building.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to work.
So these are lots of kind of sort of carrots for people who maybe want to get those into use but just don't know how, or don't know what programs there are, or like you say, don't have the kind of economies of scale for that. Like, are those, like, I know you've been doing a little bit of research around maybe what other countries have done in terms of vacancy and legislation, and are there sort of programs to help do that in other places? Are there things around legislation and vacancy that you think we can learn from? Like the Denmark example, I think you guys had a post on Medium like a while ago about the 6 month vacancy legislation, and then
yeah. So I suppose Denmark is really interesting in that the way we're approaching it in Ireland, when you read the vacant homes reuse strategy, is that the correct full name, which came out a couple of months ago.
This started this month, I think.
Was this the reason? Oh God, I'm very up to date. I'm surprised. It's very constructive, and the most constructive thing I think is the vacant homes officers. And vacant homes officers would definitely be really useful for the collaborative town centre health checks. And they have that system in Scotland, empty homes officers in Scotland. And in Scotland they have an amazing system where Shelter, which is a homelessness agency, has paired up with the government, and they have a programme, and they try and get an empty homes officer in every local authority. We're trying to get a vacant homes officer now in every local authority in Ireland, and they basically use a baseline data set. I'm going to keep banging on about data sets, but they're kind of useful. And they use a baseline data set that emerges from the council tax data. And that is kept up to date by citizens, because it's within their interest to register whether they live in a property or not. And then they can see, is that property occupied? Okay. If you don't say to the government, I've moved out, then you get charged the council tax. So you're going to tell them. So there is motivation there. So they have a baseline data. But what these vacant homes, empty homes officers do in Scotland is they go out and they work with that data, and they work with the people on the ground. They refine the data, and it's very proactive, and they use all these different incentives that they have, and they do have a number of them. But what I find I have difficulty with is the vacant homes reuse strategy is that it's all very much sticking plaster, and there's very little mention of there are reasons why we have this situation of a lot of vacancy. And so Denmark is really interesting because Denmark doesn't have this problem in the cities. If you look at the data for Copenhagen, whenever you take out their biggest problem, which is new developments being counted as vacant, and the owners of those buildings, so you imagine in Denmark, in Copenhagen, they tend to take over a huge chunk of the city and develop it comprehensively, and that might be empty, and the developer might be waiting to sell it on to somebody, so that's a little bit of a problem. But when you take that out of the data, the last report I read, and it was an official government report, that there were 333 vacant units in Copenhagen.
In the whole city? In
the whole city. And Copenhagen is a very similar size to Greater Dublin. Yeah. I think it's within a couple of 100,000. So if you get the system right, then you're not going to have this problem. Yeah. And the way that they've got their system is that they have a number of things in place, like they penalise you for a property being vacant. It's illegal to have a property vacant for longer than a certain length of time. They're able to monitor that because they have such good data on people. They have 2 data sets. They have a population register where they know everything about people. Again, it's kept up to date by people, because if you don't register onto that, you don't get any benefits of being a citizen in Denmark. So, and that includes your address. So they have information about where you live. They also have a property register, which is information about who lives in a property. And whenever you put those 2 pieces of information together, you get a pretty good data set. And they can actually tell you live who's living where and which properties are vacant or not. Now, they don't issue the information live, but they can tell. So you have systems there, and the other major thing is that they have a different tax system. They have a combination of a property tax, similar enough to what we have, with a site value tax. And site value tax is a very sensible, it seems to me, I don't know if anybody has got good arguments against it. I've never heard a good argument against it, where you value the land, not the improvements on it. And so they have that there, and that is in there as an incentive for people to use their property efficiently because they're paying tax on it. Whereas we disincentivize people to use property efficiently by not taxing incapacitated buildings. So and one of the most interesting findings that you guys have, Peter McVerry now has a great data set of Dublin. And I think all you need is a data set to actually start making policy on, because you can extrapolate it to apply to the rest of the country pretty much. But there's a unnamed person, I don't even know his name, so it's not a problem, on a street in the north inner city, Georgian area, there's about 5 houses on that street, and he doesn't pay. They cost him absolutely nothing because they're uninhabitable, and he's just waiting. He's waiting for I don't know what, because he's lived through 2 major booms, but he's waiting. And so these buildings just get worse and worse. You're losing the heritage, you're losing the space for them to be used as homes, and they get out of, they can't be repaired. So we have a system which incentivizes people to actually make them dilapidated, whereas Denmark has a system that incentivizes people, carrot and stick, to use property efficiently.
In terms of the sort of, maybe we could, like the heritage of that sort of going to waste a little bit of obviously like sort of 5 buildings. Sort of, do you think there's more that local authorities could be doing on that front, the kind of enforcement of the endangerment of these buildings?
Well, I suppose it all comes down to resources, to be fair to the local authorities. So, it's interesting in terms of architectural conservation areas. I was asking a few years ago, how many do we have in the country? And we don't actually know, because there's no monitoring of them, and there's very little enforcement. So that would be something that, again, the Heritage Council, we're trying to sort of look at. You've got protected structures, which are a building, right? But ACAs is about the common good and the sense of place, townscape, So I think if you're talking about regeneration, it's a much sort of wiser space to move into when you talk about the common good. So, it's great that Grania's here, because obviously with the ACAs, how can we use that as a tool for regeneration? There was a review a few years ago of Part 4 of the Planning and Development Act 2000 to see how could architectural heritage be used as a regeneration tool. And I think really that debate needs to be opened up, so that we can all have a say about our towns, our historic, Dublin is sort of urban villages joined up, with different character and scale. But I don't think we're having that discussion really enough, where we sort of look at design and we look at the building stock that we have. We have no building stock analysis, right, which is really, really important in other countries, as you know.
Condition or?
Building stock and then analysis. Condition,
yeah,
right?
Okay.
So we don't actually know what era, sort of certain streets were built. We don't have that mapped, whereas in Holland they do have all this done. Then as well, as Phillip said, building condition surveys, we don't do those regularly with historic buildings, and we should. So I think, in terms of the system, I think we're all sort of agreeing tonight that the system needs to be improved for monitoring. And if we don't have the baseline, it's very, very hard to do policy. It's very, very hard to do investment, because you don't actually know what you're investing in. So to me, the fundamental thing I think that needs to be sort of pushed at a national level for the benefit of us all is that the economic argument has to be looked at. And I'm not talking about financial, I'm not talking about NAMA, right? That's financial return. I'm talking about economic benefit, which is monetary and non-monetary. So it could be sense of place, it could be sense of pride, all those things that are hard to measure, but are fundamentally about, feeling that you belong here and you're safe in this area. So there is if you have derelict buildings, you have blight, urban blight. And I don't think the cost of that urban blight is maybe coming out in our policy. It's not being communicated.
I think there's interesting analysis in Flint in Michigan, where they looked at that issue, sort of at how it impacted local economies. So blight as a barrier to sort of economic development or community regeneration. And there's an institute in Flint that looked at those sort of issues across sort of the states, where sort of analysing the impact of dereliction on local communities as their sort of how they develop.
Obviously, the kind of vacancy that you're bringing back into use is for social housing. When you're looking at that and the idea of blight, and how much do you think when there's a debate around how to use vacant buildings, there has to be also an idea of building in affordability to its future use, otherwise there's a risk well, showing my colours here, there's a risk that it's going to help the affordable housing crisis as much as people might think.
Yeah, I suppose like we have a particular need. We're housing people coming from homeless services, so our priority is to provide housing for those in our services. But the broader argument is that it's reuse for the sort of the common goods. So affordable housing, like not every building will be suitable to be returned to residential use. Is there a community benefit that can be derived from it? We've a discussion recently around sort of the arts and literature, sort of like, you know, Dublin isn't affordable for people from artistic careers, but also there was a lot of concern a few years ago about the loss of buildings where artistic groups were performing or you know, meeting and stuff like that. So there's a multitude of uses, but it's that sort of system, how we determine what's needed, how we develop areas, and so that it's like we don't want to go into any town and turn all the empty buildings back into social housing for people coming from homeless services. That's not what we're about. But again, it's that sort of conversation thing. It's about building awareness. It's like, oh, this is happening, we can do it. What else can we do? And then as we do it, it gives us the legitimacy as an organisation then to go to government, to go to policymakers and say, we know from our experience that this can be done. Why can't we look at it on a bigger scale? And I think like it was somewhat interesting that the vacant homes reuse strategy was the 5th pillar of rebuilding Ireland, but it was the only pillar not to have a press launch. So I don't think the minister was here for it, so maybe that was it. But it's an incredibly important piece of the housing system and sustainability of our housing system. In that we need to understand why properties are falling vacant. We need to understand the rate of obsolescence, and we need to really dig deeper and help set up effective systems for managing the issue. I just want to go back to sort of the resources issue for local authorities. So we advocated for the empty homes or vacant homes officer because we'd seen the impact of the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership. And what I suppose is disappointing is that local authorities are now sort of pressurised to appoint a vacant homes officer. But in reality it is Joe or Mary now has this added to the end of their job title, and you know, local authority staff tend to be very much overworked anyway, so now they're being told, okay, now you're responsible for returning the 20,000 empty properties in your area. So it's and like there really needs to be a look at the resourcing of local authorities to do this, because some of it will actually be going out and about, meeting with property owners, holding meetings, doing a lot of legwork, as well as sort of trying to put systems in place. So I think local authorities could do more, but they need the resources to do that. And I think the Scottish example has brought in nearly 7,000 homes since it's been set up. And they also use another thing that we've advocated for, the empty homes tax as well. So that
what they do in Scotland is they flip the council tax. They just double it if the property's vacant. Okay. But yeah, so they have an empty homes officer per council, and they have, I think it's 8,200 in 8 years that they've got back into use. And they reckon that, and I interviewed the lady that runs this scheme, so this is coming from, she had no reason to be promoting it to me, but within 1 to 2 years, that empty homes officer, who's a dedicated person, I'm very disappointed to hear that. I'm not surprised, but because that is what happens. A dedicated person funded separately from government to the local authority, that they work with the local community, but they are separate, they're dedicated, and they have a huge impact, and they're paid back within 1 to 2 years. After that, they make money for the council.
Okay. Yeah.
So the economic argument is tried and tested in a country that is a perfect place to take your precedent for Ireland in so many ways. We're very similar size. We're not massively dissimilar culturally. We have very similar systems set up. They have a system for vacant homes. They also have a system for vacant and derelict land that is set up since the 1980s. We're just way behind in that.
In terms of sort of like, obviously maybe the vacant homes officer will work in certain situations. You talked about the Georgian sort of terrace or set of buildings where they're just waiting for the market to rise. Do you have a sense, like, when you've been doing the research or just looking at all these buildings with Peter McVerry Trust, like, sort of how big an issue that is, that kind of strategic vacancy versus the kind of just unable to navigate the system, or not having time for it, or not knowing how to bring upper floors into use, or like, is it something that is that kind of that kind of very, very sort of colourful example indicative of a wider problem? Or
yeah, I think in the main what we're finding is that multi-unit buildings, so maybe historic buildings that have been subdivided a number of years ago, where they're vacant, we tend to find that it's institutional investors or major property investors who have portfolios. So they may have active parts of the portfolio, they may have bought assets that may have sort of been distressed, or they may have bought assets at the peak of the Celtic Tiger, but there's no real pressure on them to use them, because the asset now is probably, in Dublin anyway, is probably greater in value than it has ever been. And that we're coming across, people that have 2, 3 more properties in their portfolio, and there's plenty of examples just in Dublin 1 alone where there's numerous property investors that you keep seeing the same names linked to multiple properties. So, we're based, our head office is in Mountjoy Square, and we don't have too far to go. The first vacant property is 2 doors down, and off all the streets there, Upper Gardiner Street has a number of empty buildings, and there's one guy on Upper Gardiner Street who owns one on Upper Gardiner Street and another one on Dorset Street. There's probably 8 apartments at the very least that are lying vacant, and we tracked him down. We know where he lives, and we sent him a nice letter, but he sent us a note saying, I'm leaving these empty, and if I change my mind, I'll come back to you.
Maybe, like, I think you talked a bit about collaboration and the importance of collaboration sort of between different disciplines and sort of architects and planners and all these kinds of people in terms of bringing things back into use. Like, in your experience, sort of, when have things fallen apart, and how do you see people coming together, or is it...
Well, I think, as we're all sort of saying, it takes time, to set up new systems. So, like, for example, with that programme that we've set up, the Heritage Council, we've brought in the universities, we've brought in all the institutes, we have architects, landscape architects. We have 4 departments working with us, including the Department of the Tea Shop, and they want to scale it up. But, that took time to actually build that sort of approach. The universities were amazing, UCD, QUB, the ITs, they all give their time for free. We couldn't have done it without them. The programme, the pilot, we spent 15,000. Which was just unbelievable, and Minister English was asking me about it, and I said, well, we didn't have any resources allocated. So a lot of it, as we were saying today, is to do with resources. Now, one of the things that I do have hope for, potentially, which we put into our MPF submission, was that we need a regeneration agency, in the country. So we will see, we haven't seen any detail in terms of how that's going to work with the local authorities, with the regional assemblies. But fundamentally, we do need not a development agency, we need a regeneration agency, so it's very different. And again, I'm going back to the economics here. So, hopefully...
How are those different for people?
Well, to me, development is speculative, right? So it's about the profit, it's all about the bottom line. Whereas if you're talking about regeneration, you've already alluded to it, as has Phillip, it's about, the sort of environmental benefits, it's about creating a sense of place, it's about sustainable communities. It's much wider than just getting a profit, or a super profit, which is what happened during the boom, right? So, going back to the regeneration agency, I do think that the country really needs this. We need a new approach, we need to be agile, we need to be fresh, and we need to have young people involved, which is why it was really good to have the students from the universities and the ITs actually talking about their towns and how it felt to them to be living in this town and what blight was doing to them, and also learning about homelessness and how the young people and millennials are so upset about the way that the country, is not fostering this generation. So, yes, we've got a resource issue, but we have to make sure that the resources are going to the right area, in terms of that we don't do development in a bad way again, that we create good spaces and good places where we want to live, like you're saying about European cities and stuff, that's what we want to aspire to.
But Alison, do you think that regeneration agency, which is named in the National Framework Plan, that what will it do? Will it be doing what's now called active land management? Is that what we hope
fundamentally, obviously the detail needs to be, and maybe we could discuss it as a group here tonight, but I believe that they're going to be focusing on public land first, obviously because that's there, and you would hope that possibly, we would have transport orientated development, that we would go higher along the Lois lines. I mean, there's all sort of different concepts that cities have been doing for years, that we need to look at, and we need to have an integrated approach to this. And when I say integrated, I mean collaborative as well, where we have architects, built architects, planners, actually working together. If I could give an example of last autumn, the Irish Planning Institute, which I remember of for many years, we had our conference, and then on the same day, the RAI had their conference across the river. So there was no collaboration. We were all sort of phoning each other going, are you across the river? We're over here at this conference. And we're
You
all
were talking to each other.
we were texting each other, friends. But Miriam Fitzgerald, who's on our board, she was texting me going, where are you? And I said, I'm at the IPI conference, where are you? So, that really showed up that we have to do our CPD together. We have to do our continuing professional development together. We have to get into the universities. As I say, this is where I fundamentally believe that we have to use the future as the young people. And we have to have the planners and the architects all working together at that age in groups so that they come out into society and can contribute to the best of their ability. We're not doing our young people any favours because we're not creating the spaces that they want to live in. So that's kind of what I would like to see as a collaborative approach. I think we need new structures actually, and we need new systems.
And Alison and I were talking earlier, there is a report which Alison very kindly sent me, which is by the NESC, and remember with National
Economic
and Social Council, called Urban Land Development and Infrastructure, Fixing Ireland's Broken System. Anyway,
everybody should read it.
Everyone should read it. It's absolutely
It's a very
excellent.
brave title.
Yeah, so when I was down in the Docklands at the end of last week, I think, and there's on Upper Mare Street, not to get too micro, behind the Lewis Dock, there's lots of CIA land, and just looking at the planning applications that are going in for that of high-end apartments on state-owned land, and they don't want to put a crash in. Maybe there isn't a need, maybe there is, people say different things, but just seeing how state-owned land is being developed at the moment, and then the contrast with the ideas in that report taking from Transport for London and things, maybe we could, has anybody got any questions about anything that has come up so far? Yeah.
Hello, Patrick Shields. I actually was involved when I worked in DIT in research and lecturing, and many years ago, 15 plus years ago, we'd identified the expansion of the Dublin commuter belt and the unsustainable development pattern that was emerging at the time, at the beginning of the Celtic Tiger, places like Portlaoise, Dundalk, Gorey, places up to 120 kilometres from the city, being effectively suburbanised by a population that couldn't afford to live in the city. And we recommended, looking at the continental European city model, the compact city model of reusing vacant land, or reusing brownfield sites, reusing vacant dwellings. And this was over 15 years ago, and there has been effectively nothing done in real terms since. And it's extremely frustrating that there hasn't been much done. And just it's interesting what was mentioned about Scotland. I think Scotland would be a very good example to look at, because I think the Nordic countries have a very different culture in terms of their legislative culture, in terms of their culture towards property and land ownership. There's much more of a common good approach. In Ireland, it's very much private property rights are absolutely paramount, and this is going to be a major stumbling block, I feel. People's right to the privacy of the ownership of the dwellings, and whether this information is going to be disclosed in a publicly available database, or a database available to local authorities or the relevant agencies that need to work to see if they can reuse the vacant dwellings. And it's a major issue, and there will be a need, I think, for a cultural shift. Also, the issue of resources you were mentioning to the local authorities is very important, because I worked closely with local authorities when I worked in housing research a number of years ago, and they are very under-resourced and understaffed. And there's a serious issue there of where is the extra money is going to be made available to fund something like a vacant dwellings unit, or for each local authority. What about the idea of horror, bringing back domestic rates, which were abolished 40 years ago as a political stunt, and I don't think there's any political will to go anywhere near that. So I think this is going to be a relatively long process. There's some very lofty aims here, but I think it's going to require a significant shift in thinking.
How do you see that? how do you see ideally that evolution of an understanding of property rights? Like, how I don't know if that's too, but how do people understand it at the moment as a kind of private property being paramount to shifting to something, say, understanding rights of use or that kind of thing? Is that
understanding? Well, I mean, there is a cultural issue. There's a lack of understanding of the responsibilities of property, and the Nordic countries are completely different to us in terms of their notion of civicness. And I mean, it's a huge subject as to why the Irish have, you could describe a dysfunctional relationship with property and with landscape. So, I mean, that's for another day. I would point out that the majority of us have Scandinavian DNA in it. So, it's obviously it's a historical thing. There's a lot of debate, and I'm not qualified to talk about it, but it's come up at your Collaborative Town Centre Health Check meetings about the Constitution, which can be interpreted as protecting private property rights above all others. But, as I understand it, there is also a clause in there that says, except for when there is an issue of the common good. Yeah. So I would have thought that there was a very strong argument to be made in terms of the common good for something like people's data being available. So in Denmark, people seem to be okay with the idea of people knowing freely on the internet who owns what property and what they owe on their mortgage, which is quite extraordinary for us to think about. But what is the constitutional issue? We just all say, oh, well, it's private property rights are protected. But I think it's actually much more sophisticated and complex, and there are nuances. But no one's ever given me a very good explanation of what it is, and it's my fault. I need to go and look at it.
There was
you looked at it?
Yeah, well, I tried to. I got a report about that size, which was the Joint Committee on Property Rights. I'm trying to think. It was about 15 years ago. But I mean, what's interesting is, we did some research, and when it does go to the courts do uphold the common good. So, like, there was, Fortune versus Wicklow County Council. I can't remember all the sort of test cases and stuff, right? But the courts have been good in recognising that the common good has to be upheld. But I think when we talked there as well about sort of architectural conservation areas and as opposed to protected structures, there needs to be more awareness of what the difference is between the two concepts. And I think the concepts of, common good that is culturally acceptable for us as a country need to be communicated, and we need to start talking about it and understand it and try and sort of elevate them in our society. Townscape is something, as I said, that other countries look at, and they fund programmes to try and improve townscape, which includes buildings. So you're not excluding the private property rights as such, but what you're looking at is trying to do it in terms of collaboratively and as a community.
Yep. I did my postgraduate dissertation on the suburban landscape of Dublin, the evolution of the suburban landscape of Dublin. That was a long time ago, but it's certainly the issue of urban morphology, the built fabric and landscape of cities is an area that's been very, very much neglected. Certainly in the wider field of urban geography and urban planning.
I think so as well, like in the sort of morphology, topology. Grania Shaffrey does a lovely presentation that we had as part of a landscape training course that we ran for 3 years. Again, I said to you earlier, I think it's about education, and we need to get in with the kids and try and sort of teach a design culture, teach that what is a good townscape, what is a good town, what is a good city centre, all those kind of concepts that seem to be sort of like, that the planners feel that they own them, the architects feel that they own them when it's buildings. It's everybody, we all have to live somewhere. So it's for us all. That's really what I would like to communicate tonight. And I do feel that, for the government to move forward or whatever in a positive way, and as I said, in terms of collaboratively, we're going to have new programmes. We can't just have policy. You can't introduce policy. There has to be something behind it to really bed it down, and the cultural shift that you talked about. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not aware, but there was a scheme in the 1950s and 60s to reuse a whole swathe of the inner city of Dublin as social housing, and most of Summerhill and Lower Gardiner Street and York Street were reused for social housing by Dublin City Council, but as you know, they've disappeared. What guarantees will be in place today to prevent that from happening again? Because, for example, I could envisage a lot of buildings being revived or being reused, but then they could be used as an excuse to say, well, actually, all the features were taken out because of these reusing processes, and there's nothing worth of value still in those buildings, so therefore they could be knocked. And I know there's the the planning laws that came in since 2000 to protect our heritage, but York Street was demolished in the mid-2000s, so I'm just wondering, would that be an excuse to get rid of housing into the future? Our heritage could be affected by any reuse.
Well, I think if we don't understand our heritage, and if we don't have the baselines and we don't have the sort of, as you said about the sort of topology, if we don't understand our area and our heritage, it's very hard then to move forward. It's very hard to protect or enhance or reinstate, because a lot of our landscapes, our urban landscapes, are damaged landscapes because of blight. So, there's that issue too, it's enhancement, it's all these different sort of things that need to be looked at. But yeah, fundamentally, if we don't know the condition of the building, what are we dealing with?
And if for Peter McVerry Trust, if we go to reuse a building, then like today I was looking at a set of drawings for a property from 1770 in Lois, and how that can be reused, a series of buildings, and our architects are following best conservation practice. They're grade 1 conservation architects, so it's not like we go in and it's social housing for homeless people, so we'll rip it out and we'll make it a shell. We're going in and respecting the fabric of those properties and the heritage that they carry, and we're saving them for future use, and we're trying to, whatever we get will be used for as long as possible for social housing, and we certainly won't be selling off any of our stock. So.
But again, if it's in an ACA, are they being monitored? Are they being evaluated? Again, the resources point that we made, a lot of the ACAs were created so long ago that the people have actually left who did the ACA report. So where's the corporate knowledge, in the local authorities? Some of these ACAs are wonderful, but we don't know why. Do you know what I mean? So and it's even finding the reports. It's as subtle as that, that because we've sort of moved digitally, we can't find the reports. So yeah, I think there needs to be a real investment, in terms of rediscovering our heritage, our built heritage.
Just a follow-up question from that. I just wonder, is there an elephant in the room when it comes to these reusing of buildings? Because there is a lot of buildings being reused at the moment, but they're not being reused for regular rentals, reused for Airbnb. Is that not a big threat to any of the ideas of regeneration, that the actual end buildings will end up as Airbnb?
I think one of the things we've noticed, we've put together a walk-in tour, and it's sort of a 90-minute walk-in tour of Dublin 1, and if you go around, a lot of the derelict sites and the empty buildings are being brought back to use, or they're being incorporated into developments of hotels and guest houses, or boutique hotels. And we definitely, on the other piece of that is that we definitely see in around Mountjoy Square a legal conversion or use as short-term lets of buildings that were formerly private rental properties. And so that does have and is an issue, and it does have an effect on the private rental market, and it does have an effect on people getting out of homelessness. So it is an issue. It's sort of what we sort of touched upon earlier. It's sort of what are the needs, how are they sort of monitored, planned for, and delivered, and there may be needs in some towns for short-term tourist rentals, but it's not the primary need. And I think it really comes back to who's determining this, and at the minute it's the market. And the market is leading, and we're letting them determine what happens with our housing system and our housing stock. And we would like to see the point where the state and the state agencies are resourced and are of the view that they have a role to be interventionists. And at the minute we would see too much passive behaviour in how housing is sort of administered and sort of left there to the market to decide. And it's really if you go back to the Constitution, it's common good. This state has signed up to the UN Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the right to a home. And while we signed up to it, we haven't ratified it almost 30 years later, but we are, as a state, effectively committed to providing for the right to the home. So we need to see that sort of abstract idea brought back and reflected in policy and practice. And the only way the state can really do that is to actually intervene and be the lead. And so when we made our submission to Rebuilding Ireland, the state is the lead authority on the provision of housing, and that all its agencies act in accordance with that sort of idea or value, rather than sort of, at the minute, there's sort of cultures of we're here to administer and provide for private sector. So even when it comes to the regeneration or reuse of derelict sites, the conversation has to start with what's in the best public interest and the common good for the reuse of these sites, for these communities and these locations, not determining which investors will come with the right package and the right finance to be able to lead out a private apartment scheme that, as Lois pointed to, is that affordability and accessibility for people in need of housing.
Yeah, that actually was the point I was going to make in terms of, I mean, I welcome the regeneration agency, but my concern is that the matrix on which it's determined will be the same profit financial as to whether it's successful, whether the development will stack up, as they say, as opposed to the social gain or the reversing social exclusion. I would like to think about more of a hybrid development. You talking about reusing Alan's built heritage. I think behind the traditional buildings on Main Street in every small town, there's a long urban plot. There's a lot of empty property in the backlands. And I would somehow like to see the incentives being channeled to develop, together with the refurbishment of the existing building, but the small-scale development on the plots behind, so you're making inclusive, walkable communities, and disincentivize the quick, high-profit development on the periphery of towns. At the moment, the financial incentives are there for new build, and you're creating, and it's totally unsustainable, it's contrary to the Sustainable Development Goals. And until the national policy, I mean, the draft national framework document didn't even mention the Sustainable Development Goals when the first draft came out. Now they have it in, but I don't think they fully understand that you actually need to look at all the elements, particularly transport, and the social benefits of small-scale urban grey repair. There is plenty of property in Ireland, whether it's empty or under-occupied. You don't need to be building new housing estates surrounded by walls that everybody has to drive everywhere from. It is outrageous, and it should be decentralized, and people should be encouraged to refurbish in communities. And at the moment, it is the opposite. Because it's the culture of creating any development is good job development because it creates jobs. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, that's been the mindset for so long. Now that needs to be turned around, because look at the damage it's done. And until you change that mindset and disincentivize unsustainable new build and really get into the difficult, and it is difficult, and you need to have the joined up collaborative work, and you need to have people who want to do it. You've got to have a whole different, it's for the greater good, not for profit.
Oh, do you want to respond to that? Yes.
Could I just respond to that? Because I mean, I agree with you entirely. I mean, the good thing about the collaborative town centre health checks that we're doing for the larger towns, smaller towns, is that it's helping to give us the indicators, the key indicators, and now we can work with the EPA through their strategic environmental assessment unit, right? So we're trying to say to them that vacancy should be an indicator in SEA for local area plans for LAPs. And I would agree with you, you know, potentially I had a discussion with the department about a year ago in terms of, you know, if the vacancy rates are over 40% for, say, retail, over 20% vacancy for residential, you know, if you're over 40% for retail, your town is failing, and it's a rescue strategy traditionally. Now, obviously our town centres are changing because they're no longer about retail, but they are clearly giving you an indicator of how the town is performing or how healthy it is. So, you know, I think once you go over those 20% as your key, like, red flag, possibly that's when, if you do have those indicators, maybe there shouldn't be any more development in the periphery until the town core recovers or until there's infill or whatever. But I agree with you, but we need to then obviously build this into policy, because we can't, allow development as such without knowing what is the state of the historic core. If the historic core is sick, then it needs to be enhanced and helped, aided, whatever you want to say.
Special measures.
Absolutely, but I mean, we do need to get those figures, and what frustrates me is that now we're getting these figures, which is brilliant, because you actually know, okay, that town's not doing well at all. We're trying not to put the figures out because we don't want to put them in the press, so we're talking about occupancy levels, we're talking about anything but vacancy as such, right? Because a lot of these towns have been suffering, and a lot of the commercial sector has been on its knees. So yeah, but those surveys are useful. And they also, as we did the 15 steps, right, you start to build a process and you start to build an engine, particularly in the towns that have lost their town councils, who are struggling. What's our regeneration process here,
Sorry, can I just add, I completely agree with the sentiments of the lady who just raised that point. If you look at the built landscape of a lot of our towns, medium or small towns, there is a huge amount of backlands behind the main streets or side streets that are completely vacant. And then you have these housing estates located in a sort of ribbon out from the towns. It's very, very it's very striking compared to, for example, what you have in continental Europe, or even in the UK, where you have a defined development envelope around towns and villages. In Ireland, it's a very, not even approaching the whole issue of one-off rural housing. And there's also the problem historically in a lot of Irish towns that because of the one-off rural housing being so widespread, a lot of the housing that was built in the towns, smaller rural towns, was social housing, and that created a stigma that was self-reinforcing, a self-reinforcing cycle of very little private building house building within the towns, and more one-off rural housing, and that continues up to the present time. And I just finally like to say, I think it boils down to a very fundamental question, which you were touching on. These changes that are happening at the moment in Dublin and our other urban areas where land is coming back into use, they are market driven, not policy driven. And the question is, do we have an economy in this country, or do we have a society? And I think that it boils down to that.
Maybe we can go to this woman and then to that guy.
First of all, I just want to say I'm kind of delighted with the conversation, and I'm going to say something a tad controversial in one way, because I know there's a lot of talk about the housing crisis, and I have very reluctantly want to use the word crisis, because I feel that it legitimizes a response that's a crisis response, and then we get a response that's like kind of erecting prefabs or whatever, and I don't want to be pejorative about that, but and it's not to say it, but I think what all of the discussion this evening has been suggesting that we need a long-term plan and a long-term view, and that doesn't mean that we don't have to tackle certain things quickly, but they need to fit into a longer perspective. And also the title, Reusing Ireland's Built Heritage, I think is very interesting, that it's not just about buildings. Our heritage is about a kind of a social inheritance and a cultural inheritance, which is something that isn't, restricted to one particular way of doing things. It's not the GAA and all that goes with it. It's much broader and richer, and it's actually changing all the time, thankfully, and enriching. So it is very much, Alison, you said that whole thing was sense of place. One thing, I also have a slight concern with the National Regeneration Agency, because I think we are such a centralised country, and that everything that is coming out, we are depending on government, and a lot of the department, or the section of government we're talking about, resides a few yards up the way in the Custom House, and they're great people, and but it's a very contained, limited space. And I'm interested what the panel might think, because there's been a lot of talk about resources and local authorities, and then discussion about the vacant officers, vacant homes officers, vacant buildings. Scottish example, and Scotland is really interesting, because for a long time in their planning section they had a chief medical officer who advised and influenced and made the connection between the places you live in and health. And it's that kind of way of thinking that's very important. So the vacant homes officer, and what I've heard, and again I could be wrong, so please correct me, is that it's tending to be an administrative position as opposed to maybe a strategic professional position placed in a collaborative unit that includes the planning and maybe the conservation or whatever, and are thinking really, efficiently, you could say, or strategically about how you might think about a vacant building and an area and working together. But that's not going to happen if our local authorities continue to be disempowered and aren't really, and resourcing isn't just numbers, it's about training, it's about opening up some of the inevitable silos that we can all get stuck into. So I would have great hope for our local authorities, but they've never really been allowed, they're poorly resourced financially as well as personally and skilled. So my question really to the panel is, I suppose, one, you might disagree, but two, is there a way in which our culture might shift to be able to operate more at that more complex level, which is the local level, but maybe long term, maybe it's more effective. It takes longer, but maybe we have to be a bit patient. And I'm not disputing the fact that we have urgent things to tackle.
Do we need a mayor or like?
No, I completely agree. Like the unfortunate thing is that when there's a crisis, it's knee jerk and it's a sticky plaster, and and it's just because it's a crisis doesn't mean we can't have a sustainable solution to it. I think we know, like, while we have a limited understanding and knowledge of the vacancy issue, we still know enough, and there's still enough examples out there that we could have come with a stronger hand on the reuse strategy. And I think sometimes when you're advocating for change and a response, sometimes when you elevate it to a crisis or an emergency, you then start to see things move. But it's actually getting them to listen to what you're saying and understanding that what you're talking about is a sustainable solution. So like everything that we do in the immediate should have a clear place in the long-term strategy of what we're trying to achieve. And while we say that, it mightn't be heard. So we definitely take the time to make that message heard in our meetings and our statements and our policy briefings. But absolutely, the unfortunate reality is that what we get is steps further away from the solution. So like we're now in a local election cycle. So now we start to see, the local councillors coming forward with examples of people having a planning application rejected for a shed that they've put in their back garden, and people going, we should now change the planning to allow this because it is an emergency. And it's like, this is a race to the bottom, that we are going to, have these temporary structures many years later, and it's going to be further and further away from where we need to go. Yeah. And it's really disheartening, but it's like, in a way, it's that's our political system. We need to do more with our politicians. We need to bring them on a journey where they actually have the time to delve into issues. And I think the piece around centralisation is really important, because you just touched upon, like, people have lost their town councils, so they've lost that control over their local area, and sometimes don't have never had that town council. So I think it is really important that we look to build locally and community-based movement. And I think the reuse and the town centre health checks would be a really great starting point for that, because there isn't a town in rural Ireland where you can go and not find vacant buildings. And I come from North Donegal, and every time I go back, there's an increased vacancy level within the town. So there's a shop that has closed after 109 years this week, and that is now a 3-storey building that will be vacant, and it will join the boarded up shops in the Diamond built in the 1650s. And in the meantime, we're building new build supermarkets on the edge of town and big car parks. And when a tourist eventually comes up the Wild Atlantic Way, they get to a town centre that has nothing. It's boarded up, it's empty, and if you're a young person growing up, you don't want to hang around because you see a town that's died. And I think that all comes back to the sort of the sense of place and giving communities the ability to rebuild and to take control. And just on that, I'll bring in that there's a programme in East Cleveland in Yorkshire in the UK where they actually use the empty buildings issue and youth unemployment and preventing homelessness, and they tie the three strands together, and they actually train young people in the various skills to bring back properties, and as they bring them back they're rehoused. And then if there's no empty buildings for residential need, then these young people have the skills to be then maintaining buildings for the elderly community or the disabled, or they can go in and do repairs on school buildings or community buildings. So they've actually built up a skill set of sort of, they work on old buildings or new buildings. So they've actually then created a movement that can sort of sustain and develop skills and prevent youth homelessness. So
could I think as well, Grania, the point that you're talking about, you know, the Aarhus Convention, obviously we ratified that finally. We were the last country in Europe to do it.
When did that happen?
2008, wasn't it? Yeah. But what was I going to say? So yeah, you've got the PPNs, which are obviously the public participation networks, which were set up in the Mad Rush. At this stage, I do think as well that citizens, as you said about responsibility, like, you know, if you're living and paying your taxes, I feel, you know, that we all should be contributing to our society as well. You made the point, are we a society or an economy? So yeah, Grania, and with the town councils going, definitely there's a democratic deficit in those towns. So it is heartening to create a regeneration engine with these people, with the universities and the ITs. But I mean, we have no resources in terms of, during the recession, Heritage Council's budget was cut by 82%. So, you know, there's only so much we can do as a small organisation. So, you know, I'm sort of appealing to you tonight to...
Have you thought about working with local newspapers? I feel like all of these towns must have.
We had to stop, actually, because they kept putting out vacancy rates, you know.
One thing about country towns is that the local newspaper can be its worst enemy.
Yeah, vacancy rates everywhere.
Feed negativity constantly. Yeah. Aoife and I did work in Longford, and Longford is a fantastic place. God, the people in Longford don't think so. But they can't, the press, so they'll pick up on something like vacancy, like Castlereagh, local papers all picked up on the fact it was the cheapest place to buy property, etc.
You need to join it with a solutions journalism program.
So it's something. Can I just respond to you? You asked a really question. How do you bring about? I know Philip's probably got a really good question. How do you bring about change? And it relates to you saying, look, this is something that's been looked at for years. The same thing keeps coming over.
I was doing this research 17 years ago.
But people were doing it in the early 1900s as well. It's not new. The solutions aren't new. So getting good data on vacancy isn't new. So the politicians are able to grasp that, because if you look at 1910, say Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, they were able to give speeches about exactly the sort of solutions that the NESC report is coming out with, about site value tax, a tax on the unearned increment, which is about land hoarding. So how to bring about change? We've no shortage of solutions. We've no shortage of clever initiatives. It's just we don't seem to be able to cope with them. The political system doesn't seem to be able to deal with them or to support them, because they have to take a long-term view, and they are systemic change. And we can be cynical about what are the reasons. Why did the government, however many years ago, choose a property tax over a site value tax? It was on the table. The Greens were in government promoting it. Why did that happen? Well, it happened because of vested interests.
Okay, I think you're finally being very patient.
My name is Phillip OBrien. I've come for Philip, but just a few quick things, I suppose. And I agree with Grania about the word crisis. I think it's almost like we're in a permanent crisis. But for me, I suppose this is systemic. And so we can have different explanations of vacancy, and I think that's really important, and different scales, I suppose, in terms of their impact. So shrinking city, I suppose, will have a certain level of vacancy, obviously. But the way in which that's produced is very different to the forms of vacancy we're seeing in Dublin. And most of that, I would argue, is being produced, and very sadly, through speculation. And this fits very neatly within, most urban theory would say this. This is the rent cap at work. This is people essentially saying, I'm just going to hold out, I'm going to hold out, I'm going to hold out, and then bam. And so there's really significant social issues in terms of this, in terms of what it produces. There's physical issues, it destroys heritage, both in terms of the downfall, and then in terms of how it comes in and kind of either reifies heritage, or it just completely destroys it physically, socially, and so on. I'd also caution against the kind of cultural explanations, and I think we need to be kind of careful here. This is a governance issue, and this is how the particular form of capitalism that we have in this country is very, very similar, I would argue, to kind of a US form. So you see this kind of particular form of kind of creative destruction, if you want. And so we have to think about this, and we have to think about maybe what are the solutions here. So with that, and whilst I caution again about how we copy elsewhere, we learn from elsewhere, I'm quite interested in Philip's point about Copenhagen. And so there's a question here about ownership. So what types of property relations are there? Who owns, like I know, for example, in Amsterdam at one point, you had 80% social housing, so the state playing a very active role. Vienna, 60%, I think, at some point. So there's really key questions here in terms of if we want to learn from elsewhere. Not just about land management, but it's also about land ownership. And I really welcome some of the initiatives, particularly in terms of the Peter McVerry Trust at the moment, saying, okay, we take these vacant properties and we do something else with them. Because that sends a very strong message to say, this isn't just about profit. This isn't just to pick up the management point about the economy. This is actually about creating a social good. So it'll be interesting for us.
Information in relation to
just
Copenhagen?
Copenhagen, or do you know? Or
I don't have any statistics.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I do know is that in terms of social housing in Copenhagen, there is zero vacancy in the social housing, which is quite an achievement. But in terms of who owns and how many people rent, I don't have figures. I know there are very large landowners and landlords, and that data is collected by Property Federation Group. Separately to get their own data on it, but I don't have the breakdown of it. No.
Interesting to know.
Yeah, I can ask the question because I'm talking to the right people. Yeah.
Can I just make one point, a quick point? You were just, Alison, mentioning about there's a lot of work done on the rural landscape, and there's a very good book, of course, the Atlas of the Irish Rural Landscape, which I'm sure you'll be very familiar with. What we need is now to reflect the Ireland of today, an Atlas of the Irish urban landscape. This is very much.
I think we should get together after this and see who wants to contribute. Yeah, very much so.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much to Francis and Alison and Philip, and thanks for coming along and this episode.
Thank you.